Stanford University.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Pat Devaney, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program honoring the world-renowned economist Kenneth Arrow. This program is part of a series called the Stanford Pioneers in Science, which was created to celebrate the Stanford faculty members who have won Nobel Prizes, MacArthur Fellowships in the science fields, or the National Medal of Science or Technology. There are about 45 living faculty members who have won one or more of these awards, and their scientific contributions have been well documented, but their personal stories have not been. And so this series was created as a way to capture and to preserve and to share their stories with a broader community about their own reflections on their lives and their fields. The series is sponsored by Stanford's Continuing Studies program, the Historical Society, our medical school, the Office of Public Affairs, and Hoover Institution. Ken Arrow is one of Stanford's most beloved as well as admired faculty members. His contributions have spanned 60 years, from the late 40s, when his PhD dissertation work resulted in his Nobel Prize, until just a few years ago, when he got the National Medal of Science awarded by the President of the United States. When he was a child, his father was a very successful banker, but he lost his job and all the family assets during the Great Depression, and the family ended up having to sell some personal possessions to keep going. But economic prowess seems to be an Arrow family trait. His father recovered. His sister went on to become a faculty member at the Wharton School of Business, and his nephew, Larry Summers, was an economics professor at Harvard and the former president of Harvard, and as you probably know, he is currently the director of the White House National Economic Council. So tonight's program will begin with a 15-minute summary of his many, many contributions, and then we'll have an interview with Professor Arrow conducted by Paul Costello. Paul is the executive director of Stanford Medical School's Office of Public Affairs and Communication. And following the interview, you will have a chance to pose your own questions to Professor Arrow if you will line up in the aisle behind the microphones. And I should warn you that this event is being videotaped, so your voices will be recorded but not your images. And the program will be posted in a couple of weeks on Stanford's iTunes. So I'd like to just remind you that our last event of the series will be held on Wednesday, May 20th, featuring Paul Berg. He is the biochemist who recombined DNA molecules that would not naturally combine in nature and therefore created the field of genetic engineering. It's now my honor to introduce John Chauvin, who's going to try to give us a summary in only 15 minutes of Professor Arrow's many contributions. And who better to tell this story? John is a professor of economics. He's an internationally renowned economist. He is director of Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research, and he's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. In each of these three positions, he occupies a separate endowed chair, a feat unsurpassed, I think, by any other faculty member at Stanford. He also serves as a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research, and in his free time, he's chairman of the board of a high-tech company called Cadence. Professor Chauvin's own research focuses on public finance and corporate finance. And his books on Social Security in particular have received national acclaim and are very influential in today's debate about how to restructure and save our Social Security system. When I asked John a couple days ago what he thought about the current state of our economy, he said, well, the economy is getting worse, but the good news is that it's getting worse more slowly than it did in the last 2 quarters. So with that bit of good news, please welcome John Chauvin.
So for those of you who remember your freshman calculus, the second derivative is positive. Kenneth Arrow is one of the greatest living economists. He's a leading member of the strongest cohort of economists ever. The group of economists born between 1911 and 1921 includes George Stigler, Milton Friedman, Paul Samuelson, James Tobin, and of course Kenneth Arrow. 5 of the giants of the profession. It's my theory that the Great Depression attracted the best and brightest to work on the economy, and these 5 are the best of that cohort, in my opinion. Kenneth Arrow stands out even in this company. His contributions conservatively deserve 2 Nobel Prizes, and a case could be made for 3 or 4. Kenneth still is the youngest economist to win the Nobel Prize, having won it when he was 51. At least as impressive is that 5 of Kenneth's students have won the prize. Ken Arrow went on to win the National Medal of Science in 2004, becoming the 9th economist to win that highest of distinctions. Interestingly, all 9 of the National Medal winners have also won the Nobel Prize, and that list includes Stigler and Friedman and Samuelson and Arrow. Now to his contributions. Ken won the Nobel Prize in 1972 with Sir John Hicks. The citation to the prize emphasizes Ken's contributions to general equilibrium theory. General equilibrium refers to the fact that one cannot, or at least should not, treat markets separately, one at a time, as is so often done in Economics 1. The demand for restaurant meals doesn't just depend on menu prices, but also on the price of gasoline, the price of food bought in grocery stores, the wage rate, the hotel prices, and on and on. In fact, to some extent, the demand for any particular good depends on all other prices in the economy. Even if the goods are unrelated in their use, they do interact through the budget constraint. If the price of something you consume goes up, you have less money to consume on everything else. We were reminded of this a year or so ago when the demand for just about everything was affected by the price of oil. Similarly, the supply of any particular product depends on the entire array of prices. The general equilibrium model, with all prices affecting demand and supply for each and every good, was formulated by Leon Walras in 1874. If there were n goods in the model, there were n prices. By equilibrium, we mean a whole set of prices for which there is no pressure for them to change. This is the same concept of equilibrium used throughout the sciences. In economics terms, this means that there's a set of prices where the demand is less than or equal to the supply for each and every good, with equality for goods which are not free. While the general equilibrium model is recognized as the ultimate model of the market, even a proof that there existed such a set of prices that cleared all markets simultaneously proved tremendously challenging. Walras seemed to be content that the model had as many equations as it had unknowns, but such counting isn't convincing, except in the case of independent linear equations. It took the profession 75 years to solve this problem and prove the existence of an equilibrium that is a market-clearing set of prices. Kenneth Arrow of Stanford and Gerard Debreu of Berkeley, in communication but working separately, accomplished this monumental task using developments in mathematical topology. Interestingly, their proof of existence did not lead to a method for calculating the set of market-clearing prices. That task took another 15 years. It was accomplished by my thesis supervisor at Yale and former Stanford faculty member and friend of Ken's, Herb Scarf. Ken's general equilibrium contributions went way beyond the existence proof. He made major extensions to the fundamental theorems of welfare economics based on Adam Smith's conjectures 235 years ago. The first theorem describes the circumstances under which a competitive equilibrium results in a Pareto optimal allocation of resources. This form of optimality is actually quite weak, in that in order to be Pareto optimal, a situation must be such that it's impossible to make one person better off without making someone else worse off. The second fundamental theorem of welfare economics describes the circumstances under which every Pareto optimal allocation, and there are many, can be achieved with a competitive equilibrium and an appropriate set of transfers. Arrow extended these theorems to include the case of so-called corner solutions. The traditional analysis, which used calculus, was applicable only for the case where everyone consumed at least a little of everything. But many of us consume absolutely zero of many goods. Arrow proved the fundamental theorems in a much more general way using concepts of convexity. Arrow's contributions to general equilibrium theory and welfare economics clearly merit the Nobel Prize. The proof of existence alone was a monumental contribution and accomplishment. But these contributions aren't necessarily Ken's most important. He pretty much single-handedly founded the important field of social choice theory. His PhD thesis proved the so-called Arrow impossibility theorem. Economists model individuals as rational in quite a narrow sense. Rationality implies that preferences display transitivity. That simply means that if I prefer situation A to situation B, and I also prefer situation B to situation C, then it follows that I prefer A to C. This is so elemental that it wouldn't even be necessary to ask me about A versus C if you knew my ranking of A versus B and B versus C. The question Ken tackled is whether there's such a way to aggregate individual preferences to form social preferences over public choices in such a way that the social preferences display transitivity and therefore this most basic form or trait of rationality. It was already known that simple majority rule voting can violate transitivity, but what about other ways of aggregating individual preferences to make social decisions? Ken imposed only 4 relatively simple conditions on the aggregation process and on the preferences of individuals, and then he showed in a brilliant proof under his simple and sensible 4 conditions it's impossible to aggregate rational individual preferences into social preferences which maintain transitivity. The work was so original that even his thesis supervisors at Columbia felt unqualified to judge it. Ted Anderson, later a Stanford faculty member, still an emeritus faculty member, was then one of the more mathematical economists at Columbia, and the committee asked Ted to take a look at Ken's thesis and determine whether it was any good. Ted assured them that it was more than good. The publication of Social Choice and Individual Values, his thesis in 1951, started the whole field of social choice. There have literally been thousands of publications in this field, all of which emanate from Ken's seminal work. Now, if you were to go online tonight after the seminar and the talk with Ken, and you went to the website of Bauman Rare Books, you would find that a first edition copy of this book, signed by Ken, is available for $5,200. Now, just to put that figure into perspective, the same ad has the 2-volume edition of Robert Frost's poems, published in 1950 and signed by Robert Frost, and that'll set you back $3,600. And for you sports fans, including myself, the 1950 biography of Ted Williams, signed by Ted, is available for $1,500. So Ken is greater than Robert Frost and Ted Williams combined. So now we have the material for 2 Nobel Prizes, one in general equilibrium theory and one in social choice theory. But Ken wasn't done. He had another brilliant idea. Let's go back to the general equilibrium model with N commodities. What exactly is a commodity? You might think that a black umbrella is a commodity, but it had already occurred to people that an item in a different location or available at a different time is essentially a different commodity. So an umbrella in Las Vegas in August of 2008 is a different commodity than an umbrella in Las Vegas in February, or certainly than one in Boston in March. Ken had an idea that greatly expanded the use of the general equilibrium model to situations involving risk and uncertainty. He used the concept of a state of the world, which fully describes the realizations of all uncertain variables. So the state of the world would include exactly what the weather conditions are, the unemployment rate, whether or not an earthquake had occurred, and on and on. The particular state of the world, or set of outcomes that arise, the particular state of the world comes from a much vastly bigger set of possible states of the world. Ken's breakthrough was to realize that the same item in a different state of the world is really a different commodity. Umbrellas on rainy days are really different than umbrella on sunny days, for instance. This led to the concept of contingent commodities, commodities defined contingent on the state of the world. The next step was to define a financial security that paid off $1 in a particular state of the world and zero otherwise. Such a financial security is called an arrow security. Every risky financial contract, a stock, a bond, an option, or recently we've learned a house, is actually a complex set of securities consisting of a large bundle of fundamental or arrow securities. This concept of capturing risk and uncertainty is used widely in finance. It is the basic building block for dealing with uncertainty. Just like computers and DVDs and almost everything electronic, and they're digital, and ultimately they boil down to individual bits that can take on one of two states or values, arrow securities are the bits for the modern analysis of risk and uncertainty. It was a transformational idea. So should this have been or be Nobel 3? Ken wasn't done. In fact, Ken isn't done. Ken wrote the seminal paper that started the whole field of health economics. Ken starts by asking why medical care is different from other commodities. He notes that there are unusual problems with information and uncertainty in medical care. For instance, doctors know much more about the product than the ultimate consumer, the patient. There is little of any price competition. Ken writes about the value of insurance in this market, but also about the moral hazard problems of insurance connected with patients paying very low marginal costs for their care. In the time allotted, I can't do justice to this paper other than to mention that it was commissioned by Vic Fuchs and that it started a whole very important field of study. Ken wrote a series of papers on information as a commodity, innovation, patents, and intellectual property. His 1962 analysis of learning by doing in production is another classic. The benefits of production in a particular manner are not only the outputs produced, but the experience gained by the firm and by the workers in the techniques of production. Through production, workers and firms learn how to produce a given output with fewer inputs. Some of this knowledge may be kept within the firm, but other aspects of it may provide an external benefit to the whole economy. To the extent that the firm cannot capture all of the benefits, on-the-job experience will be underprovided relative to the economically efficient allocation. But as the ads say every day, wait, there's more. Ken was a co-author in developing one of the most widely used specifications of production functions, the constant elasticity of substitution, or the CES production function. He wrote a series of papers with his friend and colleague at Stanford, Mordecai Kurtz, introducing control theory to the theory of the firm and the household into public finance. He wrote several papers on racial discrimination. One question is addressed, which he addresses, is what racial attitudes are necessary on the part of employers and workers and customers to allow racial discrimination in compensation to persist. Such analysis is essential in order to address this serious problem. Ken not only wrote on linear and nonlinear programming, he was a distinguished professor in the Stanford Operations Research Department. Now, Ken is certainly considered a highly abstract mathematical economist. However, his contributions also revolutionized the study of policy issues in any number of areas. He was on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Kennedy administration. James Tobin, one of my five greats, was a member of that council, so two of the five were there. Then in 1970, and there was a lot that he did in between, but in 1970 I noticed when I was a student that he was amongst a group of economists who opposed the massive government support for the development of a supersonic passenger plane. Interestingly, the group of economists opposed to that included Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman, three of our Fab Five. Most recently, Ken chaired a National Institute of Medicine committee that advocated global subsidies to make anti-malarial treatments affordable to the poor in Africa and Asia. Ken's collected papers were published in the mid-1980s, and they consist of 6 volumes. But there's evidence that they were published prematurely. He has written more than 100 articles since then. He has continued to work on information economics, on capturing attitudes towards risk, on income distributions and inequality, and on social choice theory. A lot of Ken's recent work has focused on global climate change, sustainable consumption, and the well-being of distant future generations. It all adds up to 22 books in which Ken is the author or co-author, 24 books in which he's the editor or co-editor, 41 non-technical articles, and 266 research papers. But it adds up to more than that. It adds up to Kenneth Arrow. Ken knows a lot about everything. He knows a lot about mathematics, politics, music, especially Gilbert and Sullivan, I'm told, drama, Shakespeare in particular, Chinese art, poetry, the history of economic thought, you name it. I can remember almost 30 years ago, I went to a department seminar given by a woman who we were considering hiring. Her research was on the 19th century British steel industry. Ken attended the seminar. Ken was a theorist, and what could he possibly know about the 19th century steel industry in Britain? Well, it turned out he knew a lot. He knew the key research findings, what the references were. He was more than ready to talk about the degree of increasing returns to scale in that industry at that time and at that location. I was amazed at how much he knew about that topic. Now I'm going to conclude by relaying a story. Ken's not sure it's true, but it was told by Eric Maskin, one of the 5 students of Ken's to win the Nobel Prize. I presume it really happened. What Eric says is that Ken's junior colleagues had all observed that on almost any subject, Ken turns out to know a lot more about it than they do. They found this a bit frustrating. So they concocted a plan. They would all study up on one of the most arcane topics they could think of, the breeding habits of gray whales. On the appointed day, they gathered in the coffee room and waited for Ken to come in. Then when he did, they started talking about whales and the elaborate theory of a marine biologist named Turner on how gray whales found their way back to the same breeding spot year after year. Ken was silent. They had him at last. With a sense of delicious triumph, they continued to discuss whales, and Ken looked more and more perplexed. Finally, Ken couldn't hold back, so he blurts out, "But I thought that Turner's theory was entirely discredited by Spencer, who showed that the hypothesized homing method couldn't possibly work." With all of these prodigious accomplishments, Ken is humble, warm, and a great friend to all of us at Stanford. I have learned when he starts a question that he often says, "I don't understand." And he's really being polite, because usually what he means is, "You don't understand." So it's an honor to have summarized Ken's economic contributions. I have highlighted some fantastic accomplishments. I'm positive that I have missed some real gems. And in conclusion, I would like to say it's great to see Selma Arrow, Ken's wife of 62 years, an economist in her own right. They met at the Coles Foundation in Chicago. And so he's not only a great economist, he's a great family man. Ken Arrow.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. How does it feel to hear your life summarized like that?
Embarrassing. Well, of course, nobody can help being pleased, to be fair about this. I'm not that self-abnegating, but you can't help feeling there's a little more than I deserve.
When I heard Pat say that Larry Summers was your nephew, I wondered if you just want to pick up the phone sometimes and say, "Listen here, Larry."
Oh, yes, but I certainly do, but I refrain.
And what would you tell him right now? What would you say about the... let's put him on the spot. What would you tell him about the direction of the country, the economic situation of President Obama?
Well, I think this is one of those situations where nobody can be really very sure of anything. There's a part of one thing I have not done any work in, but I've associated with people involved in complex systems theory. And what you really discover is that you don't know what's going to happen, essentially, under certain circumstances. I don't mean normally, but, we have a kind of a collapse. We have various views as to what to do about it, not excluding doing nothing. I have lived for a long time, and of course, this is very familiar to, I can remember, even though I was quite young, discussions as to how to get out of the Great Depression. What was the proper thing to do? There was a president who was really one of the probably ablest presidents we've ever had, Herbert Hoover, whose idea was the thing to do was nothing. Let the natural forces restore. He was a humane man. He was not cruel. He was intelligent. He liked to have people around him who knew data and observed trends. He appointed a presidential commission on social trends to acquire the data for a background for policy. I think it was dead wrong, of course, and tragically wrong. But it did show the difficulties having, and in the end, I think more because of a sense of humanitarian unwillingness to let people starve, rather than a really considered intellectual viewpoint, although there was that too, to be fair about it. We had the idea we should put people to work. If the private sector isn't going to do it, let's spend money to the public sector. And there was already some theorists, economists were arguing that there was the idea of getting people, if you start spending money, people will go to work, and then they will spend money, and you have what we came later to call a multiplier. Today, we have, and also the situation was similar in many ways, because it was both a financial crisis and a shortfall of demand. The two are associated. We've had, over the years, a number of times when there was no real financial crisis, but the economy did sort of go downhill, at least temporarily. That's happened. But usually a financial crisis is usually accompanied by a serious fall in output, employment, and the like. Now, obviously, I think the main lines of policy that have evolved, with which certainly my nephew is associated, and certainly contributed to, but there are others involved, is I think basically correct. We have two things. One is to bring the financial system back into order, and the other is to restore demand by what's called stimulus. And I think both of them are clearly correct. We have no real idea as to how much you have to put in to get a certain effect. We don't really know. There are my colleagues of mine here at Stanford who will tell you the effect is going to be very weak. Most of us, I do not share that view, but it's held by very serious people whose intellectual capacity I respect. I'm more concerned about, I think, the details on the financial side. I probably would be calling for somewhat different matters.
You mentioned the Depression, and I remember when we spoke a few weeks ago, you said pretty much that your parents protected you from the ravages, the knowledge of they had to sell possessions to keep the family intact, but pretty much you weren't really aware of how brutal it was. Reflect upon those times.
Well, yes and no, perhaps I may have not quite conveyed it. Certainly in the sense that my home was stable.
Stable. Right.
There was food on the table. We were evicted a couple of times, but, we found another place to live. Evicted for non-payment of rent, that is. So I was not unaware, but of course I read the newspapers vociferously. I knew people around me. You couldn't help knowing the vast amount of unemployment. You go to the movies. It was a newsreel. We always had newsreels in those days, and they'll show you lines of people lining up to get soup. This was so. Certainly, I cannot be said that we were in any way unaware of the situation, and not only in the United States but elsewhere.
Dr. Chauvin mentioned the number of great economists who came out of the Depression period. What's the correlation, the dots? Can you connect some dots for us there?
Well, it certainly made the subject matter of economics very serious. You know, before that, during times of prosperity, the big argument was typically how high should tariffs be? About the question of obstacles to trade. And economists, of course, were always for free trade, and there was a lot of pressure for particular industries and workers in particular industries and employers in those industries to protect protect steel or not automobiles, but steel from foreign competition. Textiles. But this somehow is not a very dramatic issue. And while it affects individuals, it's sort of a play of parochial interests, which was not challenging. Here was something very serious. Here was a set of things which affected the welfare all around you, affected many people's welfare. And the fact that the system could fail and fail so spectacularly, and well, this isn't the Great Depression, it's a pretty spectacular, we're living again in a period of pretty spectacular failure. Maybe, really second only to that period in this, according to many dimensions anyway. So it I think stimulated a lot of people to take economics as an important matter, and probably drew some people in that field that might have gone to other fields otherwise.
Your mother once said that it was hard to discipline you as a child. When she sent you to your room, you just grab an encyclopedia. Were you always a voracious reader, and did you focus on any specific text? Did you focus on any specific subjects, or was it Renaissance?
Yes, I was a voracious reader from a very early age, as soon as I could read, which was, I suppose, probably before I got into elementary school, or certainly within the first year. I found reading very enlightening, broadening. It gave me an impression of a whole world beyond it. What did I read? Well, I tend to read factual things, history, not fiction. I wasn't so interested, read Child's fiction, and A.A. Milne was the brand new writer of that day, and first my mother read it to me, then I read it I read Winnie the Pooh and things like that for myself. That was the equivalent of Narnia or whatever. That's already behind the times, I know. But that didn't intrigue me so much. There wasn't much interest in that. It was mainly geography and history, I would say, more than anything else. Interested me.
As many men of your generation, many men from the East Coast, the City College of New York is where they went to school along with you. If they didn't charge tuition, it probably would not have been able to do your college education had they not charged had it been not free. What responsibility do you feel a government has to higher education, making it available for people? And is there an economic dimension to this question, or is it a matter of morals? Or is it both?
Well, I've thought about this quite a bit, and the question of in terms of policy today. And my view is that the income of the parents should never be a barrier to education. But it doesn't quite fully answer the question. I'm a little more inclined now to think the student has some long-run responsibility. That's to say that the student should really pay the cost of their education at some point in the future. Typically, a college-educated person will, over the course of his lifetime, be able to pay back tuition and maybe somewhat more pretty easily. It's not really that costly. And at the time, it's a tremendous barrier, and it should not be a barrier in terms of what the parent's income is. The reason I say that is partly because that on the whole, people who go to college come from groups that are somewhat higher income than those who don't go to college. So it's not exactly a redistribution that you might think. It does offer opportunity for individuals from poorer classes to get ahead, and that's important. Numerically, it's not going to be so great, but proportionally, it's not going to be so great. But numerically, as a whole, this can be a large number of people. So I think there is an obligation to make sure that it's possible But I don't see any. And from a practical point of view, it may be that just collecting the higher taxes will be on the incomes will be enough. But if education is, as it is, in fact, somewhat difficult to finance, I really don't want the cost of elementary and higher education to be financed by lose out compared to higher education.
You served in the military, the Air Force, during World War II, and I noticed that one of your first papers was published during that time. How did the military affect your career, and what sort of change, did it change the type of things that interested you?
Actually, not strikingly, to be frank about it. I was put in a research, I was in the weather service, and I was put in a research group. Partly because I had a strong statistical background. They used me to essentially ways that use my statistics primarily. But the use of statistics and weather really didn't transfer much into my economics. I did come up with an interesting problem came up out of the weather, which led to a paper, but that paper had probably very little influence on anything I subsequently did. In fact, it should have had more influence, because later on I was using the techniques in that paper, but I'd come to them again. It was not really because I had learned them the first time, and I didn't quite realize the implications. The only thing that happened is I was a little older.
As John Chauvin and Pat has mentioned, you are the youngest economist ever to win the Nobel Prize. You're one of only a handful of people who won both the Nobel and the National Medal of Science. And both of those are clearly great accomplishments. At the same time, 5 of your PhD advisees have also won Nobel Prizes. And usually we think of people as great thinkers or great scholars or great teachers, but not both. And you certainly are both. And is there a connection in your mind between your strengths as a scholar and those as a teacher?
I have to think about that a bit. I think, well, maybe this is going to sound a little modest, but I think one of my characteristics is that I'm never very sure that what I've already done is right. I was questioning my own self, what I've done, what the limits on what I've done, how it didn't fully answer the question I started with, or in other cases, it really raised new questions that I hadn't even thought of before as a result of this.
What do you think it is? What do you think about your temperament and character that leads you to that?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that question. Maybe somebody else can. But what I was trying to get at was the idea that I think this attitude is productive, is very helpful with the right kind of student. Say, here's a problem. I don't know the answer to it. Don't think you're going to follow it out, do something in my line and expect to please me. It's if you challenge me. If you say, well, you didn't do this enough, or you were wrong on this, that's something I really appreciate. I think that may have been with the right kind of student, of course. That can be very, very helpful.
We were talking earlier about, and I was wondering if you feel that your most significant contribution was what you won the Nobel for, or was that the Riley Scholarly Award?
Well, I would say that a couple of things that, and I guess some of what Professor Chauvin said touches on this, that a couple of the things which did not get the prize were probably at least as important as those I did. Well, the prize was given in a curious way because it was talking about welfare economics, but it included under that my social choice theory, which I must regard as something I'm very proud of. But there were other things. One was the general equilibrium with uncertainty, which I think was a very novel idea. It's one of those ideas that once you have it, everybody says, well, how could you ever have thought otherwise? But nobody had thought that way. The other, which I really like more than anything else I've done, is the discussion of health economics, not only because it dealt with a very important issue, but because it introduced an entirely new set of concepts, which is the importance of the fact that when people make contracts or deal with each other on markets, they recognize the fact that they have different degrees of knowledge. I mean, in the medical context, the physician knows more about what to do about your health than you do. Therefore, you're not in a very good position to check on whether the physician is doing well for you, because your knowledge as to what should be done is less than his or hers. Similarly, the insurance company doesn't know as much about the case as the physician or you, and therefore there's another problem as to how you compensate. So all these together, they both illustrate a point which, of course, is of great importance in fields other than health, and that's this question of what's become known technically as asymmetric information. That I know something you don't know, we're making a deal. So I may take advantage of you, you may take advantage of me. I'm afraid the present financial crisis illustrates a lot of these problems. The buyers and sellers of these securities had very different knowledge bases, and they should have, and this has very striking implications for efficiency. I was also arguing, and this way is still to be followed up, that one of the ways society deals with this asymmetric information is to create new institutions, not the markets and not but professional ethics, for example, in the case of health, as an institution for rectifying, offering some barrier, some protection against the ravages of asymmetric information.
As we begin this national debate about health care reform in the Congress, the White House, what do you think are the important aspects, significant things that the administration and the Congress need to ensure are part of this package?
Well, I don't think I'll be a lot of what's being said is correct, or most of the points have been made, though a lot of irrelevant points have also been made. The first point, of course, is that you want to guard against one of the dangers in private health plans is what we technically call adverse selection, what is sometimes frequently referred to as cherry picking. You know, you have a plan, let's say it excludes pre-existing conditions. That's not very good. When I'm born, I don't know that at the age of 40 I'm going to have a pre-existing condition. I want insurance. And this is one of the advantages of compulsory insurance, of insisting everybody insured. Then you can't get adverse selection. You can't have insurance plans that weed out, give less protection, or refuse to take at all people with pre-existing conditions. A lot of this idea of competition among plans depends upon this idea. You're getting the healthy people, you charge them less, but that means you're excluding a lot of people, which is a social need. So that's one of the first points, is that the plans really have to be essentially universal and for life, not starting to pick people out at certain ages, at which point they already have different conditions that we know about. Another aspect of the matter is the need to control costs. When you have a competitive market, costs are controlled, because if your costs are high and somebody else can cut costs, they'll drive you out of the market. Now, because of all these problems with the health insurance, I haven't given you all of them by any means, but there are more than I haven't gone into. The forces of competition don't work so well. So in fact, to the extent that we intervene and make them not work well, we also are reducing the checks on inflated costs. And of course, there's a question what you mean by inflated costs, or you begin to get to. So once you get it out of the market, you begin to get the ethical arguments, which are sometimes very inconclusive. So I think we're going to have methods which, even in the presence of compulsory insurance, still control costs.
Are you concerned about the current employee-based system?
The current employee-based system is totally illogical. It makes no sense at all. It's rather unique to the United States. And and it arose from a historical accident in World War II. The health status has nothing to do with employment status. And especially if the employer's offering of health insurance is voluntary, which it is, then this creates enormous numbers of problems. For example, suppose in the normal course of events, we want a dynamic economy to be one in which some firms go out of business or shrink and other firms gain. That's what we want. In order to have technological progress, you have to have that. Old industries are displaced by new industries. But if your health plan, if your health plan is linked to your employment, then this means that there's tremendous resistance to anything which involves downsizing or the ending of firms, as we're seeing with General Motors now. It creates an illogicality and an obstacle to the free performance of the labor market. So that is one of the big costs associated with this. There is, of course, the fact that some firms do offer and some firms do not. Now, in a competitive market, workers will take that into account in this choosing which firm to take from. But once they're in the firm, they have a property right in this health insurance, which is lost if they go out, and it's lost if the firm has to lay them off or something. So there is no real sense to this present system. However, I don't want to it is a system which covers a lot of people. And I want to make sure that we don't abolish it without having a good system in its place.
In the U.S. right
I don't want it. There are plans around for using health savings accounts or something like that to replace or at least partially replace the employer-based systems. And I think until we're sure there's a really adequate substitute, I would like to go slowly on abolishing the employer-based. But ideally, they should go. There's no logic to it.
And do you totally dismiss a single-payer system? A single-payer system? Do you dismiss that?
No, not at all. I'm in favor of it.
You're in favor of it?
I'm in favor of a single-payer system. I think that's the only logical. For a time I was hoping for a more competitive. I think we can have competitive systems in the sense that there's a single payer, but the individual can choose among different health plans. Now, this is a common system abroad, say in the Netherlands, Israel, and Germany have systems of this kind where you can choose things. Great Britain is a different system. I think the Canadian system is pretty much also the same kind. So we have a lot of experience. These systems do work. But I think there's a need for a single payer to avoid all these problems of adverse selection and moral hazard, which I've alluded to before.
I want to go back to the economy, and today the market...
Oh, excuse me, one more thing. Okay. The other thing is that it happens the present system has tremendous administrative costs. When you have multiple insurance systems, you have multiple forms, and it's been calculated that at least something like 5% or more of our health expenditures go to filling out forms, which would be avoided under a single-payer system.
Today the market rallied on news. The Fed sees some bright spots in the economy. The president yesterday, as you know, saw glimmers of hope. Where do you think we are in this economic crisis? And do you see the same glimmers of hope that the president, Washington, is seeing? Or are these illusions?
I think I mentioned earlier that the idea that we can actually predict what's going to happen is foolish. But if you look back and look at economic forecasting, it doesn't have, even under much more stable conditions than we have now, by the way. The record is very poor, and for anybody to say they know where we stand is rather silly. I think it is true that looking at the perspective, let's say, of last October, the financial crisis is not as bad as one might have feared. We didn't have the freeze that we had, let's say, in the Great Depression. People are borrowing money. It's a little harder, but they're borrowing money. Credit is, you can get mortgages. So I don't think and that could have all frozen completely. And I think the interventions, the TARP, really did show some function. The stimulus is too early. Obviously, there's much too early to see any effects from the stimulus. My guess is that we're getting toward We're not at the bottom.
We're not at the bottom yet.
Well, I think everybody, I don't believe, who knows? That could be wrong too, but I think the odds are that we've got a ways to go because once you start this process of laying off jobs, the cumulative effects take time to work out. So we're going to see more. But because the spending can't be important for at least 5 or 6 months. But I think, I'm not prepared to say this. I noticed that the statements from Washington have a certain degree of optimism, but they're all carefully couched in cautionary language.
One theory you hear about the financial crisis is that it was predominantly on misuse of weird financial instruments like credit default swaps.
Yeah.
It makes it sound like the economy was basically sound, but financial shenanigans dragged it down. And another theory is that the amounts of household debt that the Americans were fundamentally overleveraged, and that a crisis was inevitable. The only question was, when was it going to happen? Which of these explanations seems right to you, or do you think it's a combination of both?
Well, I'm not sure they're very different explanations, actually. We've had crises in the past. For example, the S&L crisis of the late 80s, which was very similar to what happened here, although it was contained. That showed that leveraging is a fundamental problem, whatever form it takes. And these complicated securities, in a way, were just a way of leveraging more intensively in a little less open way, a more opaque way. The real problem is leveraging, meaning that if there is a fluctuation, it gets magnified enormously. And that's the real problem with leveraging. If you have a 3% margin and stocks, or whatever your asset is, your houses or your stocks, fall 3%, suddenly you begin to start attacking the creditors, and they in turn, because they're financial institutions, restrict their lending, and you get this cumulative effect rapidly. So I think the high degree of leverage is the basic problem, in the sense that given that something is going to happen, and in this case, it's a little puzzling because the fact that housing was in a boom and that this boom couldn't really last was being said publicly by a lot of people. There was there was a lot of nervousness about the housing boom from 2005, 2006 on. So the question is, why did the creditors, the people who lent the money, not say, well, I better be a little cautious about these mortgage-backed securities. The underlying base is going to be, it looks as though it can't keep on going this way. And when you have, no down payment mortgages, it doesn't take much, it takes the smallest fluctuation to get you underwater. So there is a little bit of a puzzle as to why these firms, in their own interest,
Was it greed?
It didn't. Well, but greed is not. It's not easy to say they're greedy when the net result is they went broke. I mean, it's a funny kind of greed. I mean, now I won't go. I mean, we can go into the various theories about it. One is that, from the point of view of the individual, say executive, the worst that can happen to them is they lose their job. But meanwhile, they can be making huge amounts of money. There's the downsides hit the firm, but they don't hit the individual so much. That's one theory. I don't want to say it's true or not, but at least that's a possible explanation. But you see, we already saw this with the fact there was an alarm bell in the night, which we ignored, and that was the long-term capital management failure. Now, not the fact that long-term capital management failed. I mean, you take risks. There's nothing inconceivable about the idea that you'll fail. The problem is, why did it affect a lot of other institutions? Why were people lending to LTCM when they knew that LTCM was putting up 3 cents of its own money for every dollar it invested, and the other 97 cents were coming from bankers, from banks? Why? The question is, why wouldn't the banks say, well, we'd rather see you get 10% of your own money, at least 10% of it is your own money, or something like that. But it didn't. Now, that was taken care of. That was confined. But remember, it was a worry, and took intervention, it took planning to get this out. In the end, the government, neither the Federal Reserve nor the Treasury had to put up any money. They arranged a private transaction, and it was contained. But it was that may have been unfortunate because it didn't set off the alarm wasn't observed.
During the presidential campaign, Senator McCain was ridiculed for saying the fundamentals of the economy were sound. And a few weeks ago, Obama advisor Christina Romer said the same thing, made the same point. And I'm wondering if we can agree on, are the fundamentals of the economy sound, if you can agree, and if in fact, what are those fundamentals of the economy?
Well, first, I'm not so sure that the fundamentals of the economy are sound. No, look, it's a matter of degree. Depends how badly you think something is before you call it unsound. The word sound in that context, both as probably as used by Professor Romer and I suppose by Senator McCain, has a long-run connotation about it. You know, if you're going to ask what's the country going to be like 10 years from now, the current problems are going to disappear. That would be true no matter what you did. However, you can have an awful lot of pain in that intervening 10 years. It's not that much of a consolation to say that the average person in the year 2025 is going to be, you know, better off than the average person today. That if we've had 3 or 4 years with 10% unemployment, as the Japanese did have, by the way. Remember, it's not as though this can't happen. We can't really argue. I'm not prepared to say this is irrelevant, even though in some. So the word fundamentals has to be interpreted. We're hurting now. Okay. Now, what they mean is the growth patterns of the country, which are largely dictated by our. Now, they've been dictated by what? By our willingness to save, and by our ability to produce new goods, to learn how to produce existing goods better and how to produce new goods. Now, the fact is the rate of growth in the United States in the last 10 years or so has not been enormously good. It's not as though this is some huge success story. The highest rates of growth we had in this country were in the post-war period, which of course was something of a rebound, and partly a rebound, and so I don't want to make too much of that. At a time, by the way, when tax rates were enormously higher than they are today. Just to go off with a piece of territory you haven't gone into. But our growth rates have been commendable. But there's like a steady 1.5% per capita rate of growth. Which is okay. We're not saving very much. The investment is being financed by foreigners. Now, this may change, because I think people are frightened enough to where they're going to change their savings habits. But the savings has been, and this is not a new observation. People, since 1995, economists have been pointing out how low the savings rate in the United States is, and it's been going down steadily to the point where it's practically zero in 2007. We weren't saving money. We were spending as fast as we saved it. We financed our additional investment by borrowing from the Chinese. So I'm not sure that I'm not even sure think that even at that long run level we're doing so. Then of course there is this well-known fact that we're accumulating certain obligations to the future, and I think particularly in health care. No matter what system of health care we have, by the way, even if we stuck to the present system, you'd have this problem. Health care, retirement, Social Security, we're building up costs to the future, which are going to have to be paid for somehow. And if you resist paying it by taxes, you're going to have more problems. The government essentially is going to be having a negative savings if you keep on running deficit, which adds to the problem about savings. We have an adverse, which is all related to this, the adverse foreign account. We're importing more than we're exporting. So the statement of the fundamentals of sound is not something I'm really prepared quite to agree with.
When you look at the auto industry, does it trouble you that we are staving off inevitable bankruptcy, perhaps, of GM and others? Or do you think that that the federal government is positioning itself correctly right now, pumping more money in and trying to have these companies survive?
Well, they seem to be shifting their policies in the last few weeks, and they seem to be hinting at a bankruptcy, which will presumably, the purpose of the bankruptcy, as far as I can see, is to wipe out obligations to the workers and wipe out obligations to the bondholders and to the retired, not only to the current workers, but also to the retired workers. So somebody's going to pay things. Now, it's probably much less easy to defend the idea of protecting a particular industry like automobiles than it is to talk about protecting the financial sector, which flows into everything, or to have stimulus where the money goes as people choose to spend it. We just give them jobs, and we just get to create demand, say for the public sector demand, like highways and school buildings and things like that. The fact is that General Motors was losing money 2 years ago, when automobile sales were at a peak. So it's clear that there's something more here than just the fact of a decline in demand. The automobiles, of course, the demand for automobiles has dropped enormously. Toyota is suffering too. I mean, I think their projected sales are going to be 40% off next year than they were the previous year. So it's not as though the drop in automobiles is affecting everything, but the whole of them. But Toyota's not going out of business. Even Ford doesn't seem to be going out of business. I mean, the automobile industry is a cyclical business, always has been. There are good explanations as to why that should be true, and a company is expected to ride that out. So I think the idea of pumping money into General Motors or Chrysler is probably a big mistake.
Do you have any concerns that the federal government essentially fired Rick Wagner as the head of GM?
Well, if you're going to own the company, you're going to be responsible for it. I don't have any particular idea whether Rick Wagner was bad or good, but on the whole, if a company's been losing, let me put it this way, supposing the government weren't involved at all, wouldn't you think a man who's been president of a CEO of a company which has been losing money steadily for many years, somebody who might think perhaps ought to step down?
You would think.
Whoever's running it, if the government is now playing the role of the stockholder, then the government intervenes. The usual problem with private corporations is that stockholders find it very, very difficult to act. There are lots of reasons why that's true. I won't go to this. This observation has been pointed out. There was a book, about 70 years ago, at least 70, something like 70 years ago, by two writers, a law professor named Adolph Burley and an economist named Gardner Means, called The Modern Corporation and Private Property, one of the great classics. And they pointed out then that the idea that the stockholders owned the corporation was an illusion. And that the CEOs. So somehow or another, but even then, sometimes board directors, I've been a member of a board of directors twice that fired the CEO. Because he wasn't performing. Now, directors do not always act with that degree of independence. There were various reasons. In both those cases, which made it a little special. That's why the directors had unusual authority. It was not typical.
When we met a few weeks ago, we started talking about the Carter administration and deregulation. And you skipped very eloquently through all of the presidents and gave sort of an analysis of their economic policies. And I wondered if you'd do that again, starting with Carter, going out to Reagan, then Bush, then Clinton.
Deregulation, you mean?
And across the board on economic policies.
Well, I'm not sure.
If you can just skip through the highlights of those.
Well, I'll try to do as briefly as I can. The Carter administration had a very able set of economic advisors, particularly a man named Charles Schultz. There had been a lot of complaints that the regulation of a number of industries, trucking was an outstanding example, but airlines was another, were really designed to protect the interests of the companies, not anything else. They were essentially a way of curtailing competition. And Schultz started the process of deregulation of particularly of airlines and trucking, that introducing more competition, which has certainly led in both of those cases to a considerable reduction in prices. The consumer is better off. It deregulation created problems too, as we know. That was confined to these of course, this process was accelerated under Reagan. And on the whole, I don't think most of these things did not concern the financial sector, which I think is where the real problems of deregulation have come. The Reagan administration went back and forth on the question of taxes. It started out with a typical anti-tax movement we've had in this country now, beginning around then, about that time and continuing today, a very strong anti-tax view. Cut taxes. We had Proposition 13. I don't remember the exact date now, but it was in that period. And you see this today in local California politics and also throughout the country. And Reagan started that. However, in the second administration, there was a reform of the tax system, which involved an increase in taxes, but more importantly than that, the elimination of a great many loopholes. One of the big problems with the income tax is you have these high rates, but you have all sorts of special exceptions built in and lots of opportunities. In fact, it was pointed out by people who were just calculating the statistics that you had, even before that, nominal rates of like 60%. That was a little earlier. Reagan cut that. But very few people paid more than 30% of their income, in spite of these high rates. In fact, there was always some various things around oil leases or something like that, which prevented this from happening. But then there was a very good reform done under 86, I guess, under Reagan, which really improved the income tax, raised the rates slightly, but above all eliminated a lot of loopholes. And it really was a great reform. Of course, the trouble is that as years passed, more and more loopholes were put in. Bush Sr. came in under the view that taxes were a bad thing and certainly would never raise taxes, and promptly raised taxes. And this comes to a very interesting shift in the political situation. Traditionally, the idea is that the Democrats are the people who don't care too much about fiscal discipline. They want to spend, and, well, maybe they want to tax too, but if they can't tax, they'll spend anyway. What's happened, of course, over this period, beginning in the 80s, was a complete reversal. It was the Republicans who run big deficits, and the Democrats were insisting on fiscal responsibility. James Tobin was certainly a man who believed in fiscal responsibility that we're talking about. That you can run a deficit if it's intentional and if there's a particular reason, like a recession, but not as a long-run proposition. And this was more and more disregarded. Now, George H.W. Bush switched back and forth on that point. The Clinton administration went in, again, for somewhat higher taxes, for cutting taxes on the poor through the earned income tax credit, which I think is one of the big improvements in redistributive justice we've had for a long while. It was very much concerned about fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets. Of course, I won't go into the various economic arguments used for that. However, I must fault the Clinton administration for its lax attitude on financial regulation. What happened is there's kind of an arms race between regulators and regulatees. I mean, that's true in any industry, but it's especially true in the financial sector. In the 30s, we had very extensive regulations because as a result of the collapse of the banking system. Banks had to maintain high reserve ratios. Stock market margins on buying stocks were 50% instead of 5%, and so forth. But there began to be whole new sets of securities that hadn't been dreamt of before. But the options, which were really a very small market until the early 70s, became very big. I won't go. Economics contribute to that one. That's made too long a story. and the various kinds of derivatives of all sorts of options, for example, came to existence. And the question came up of regulating them. And essentially, the Clinton administration, through its leading financial authorities, vetoed that and prevented, in fact, actually introduced a bill to prevent regulation of these derivatives. Now, one of the arguments in favor for that was advanced was the only people who were allowed to trade in these securities were people who had large amounts of money. You had to have certified that you're worth $1 million or more to be involved in this business. So the argument is these are not the sort of people you usually think of protecting, the poor, innocent person who doesn't know very much. These are people who have a fair amount at stake, and also presumably, if they acquire $1 million, they can afford to buy advice, or they can they're skilled themselves. But nevertheless, they did prevent the regulation and permitted the financial innovation to go on. So you began to get a whole new financial structure outside the previously regulated areas. There was actually also some real repeals of the old regulations, particularly the law, the so-called Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which prevented commercial banks from engaging in investment bank activities, separated commercial banks and insurance companies from investment bank activities. This was repealed. So there was a considerable deregulation of the financial sector, which went along with all this fiscal probity and responsibility. The subsequent administration, the recent President George Bush, certainly had no attempt to re-regulate. Certainly was not in any way interested in recapturing any of this regulatory behavior. Was interested in cutting taxes to what I consider a dangerous degree, with no concern for the fiscal responsibility. On top of which, of course, then we had a big addition to our expenditures occasioned by the Iraq War. Now, ordinarily, you think of a war as a time of sacrifice, that you pay for the war. At least the present generation, to some extent, pays for the war. That's what happened in World War II. We did run a big deficit, but we also had higher taxes, and of course the country was paying in the form of a draft and rationing. Now, the Iraq War didn't call for the same kind of drastic actions, but it certainly suggests that at least you could have done was pay for the war financially. Since you didn't have a draft, you didn't have rationing, at least there should be some sense. Anyway, from an economic point of view, it was piling up. It was involved in inflating the economy. And this was, as I say, matched by the fact that the private sector saving also went down during the same period. So I think the situation on all these things has been a little mixed.
Do you think that we're going to see, some believe that we're going to see a radical realignment of American culture after we get out of this, after we recover? The notion is that the American culture will give up their thirst for purchasing and buying, and they will enter some sort of Zen state of mind. Do you think that's even possible?
Let me first point out that when you say America, the average American hasn't seen any increase in income. The median income, or the people who are 50% or below, 50% or above, in real terms has remained unchanged for 15 years. I will say they probably were consuming more, saving less. The median person was probably saving more or less. But the big increase in income and the big increase in conspicuous consumption has been in the highest brackets, and most of it is in the upper 1%. The percentage of income going to the top 1% has reached levels which will last, it's observed in the 1920s. Been a very careful study of that. And the consumption levels correspond. So let me say, the average person hasn't been living that high on the hog. Now, whether an economic downturn will actually produce much change in attitudes, I'm not sure. We had our last Zen movement with the beatniks and their successors, the hippies, and so forth. I don't think that penetrated very much into America, in spite of the very conspicuous things. I don't think it penetrated very much into American culture, And I have a somewhat heretical point of view that this indrawn concentration of the self is not at all incompatible with an emphasis on consumption. It's a variation. It's an indrawn, socially isolating kind of experience, and is not really. It can turn quickly from, yeah, I'm poorer than you are, right, to I'm richer than you are.
Were you surprised that?
Certainly, one thing I will say, I do think, to put it a little more moderately, that people will be, for at least for some time to come, savings rates will be a lot higher. People have been frightened. I mean, its effect will wear off after a while, but it may take 5 or 6 years.
Were you surprised by Bernie Madoff and what he was able to accomplish, what he was able to pull off?
I don't really understand it. I do not quite understand what happened there, and I think there's a lot to the story we don't know. The fellow was supposed to, I mean, the $70 billion that they talk about is, of course, it was somewhat fictitious. This is what he claimed it was worth. And nevertheless, he must have taken in a lot. Where is it?
Big question. Where is it?
I mean, one possibility, evidently, there's no question that he deceived a lot of people. A relative of mine got stung by it. But how he could, the magnitudes are so staggering that either there's some exaggeration or he's got an awful lot of money salted away in Swiss bank accounts.
Before we take your questions, I'm going to close with one. One of your biographers wrote the following: Kenneth Arrow is perhaps one of the most respected and admired living economists. In many ways, his life is exemplary in that the almost incredible success that have accompanied him have not in any way hardened into that arrogance and pettiness so common among professional scholars. Arrow ranks highly among economists for his personal and intellectual generosity and openness, and his consistent refusal to engage in ideological quibbling. If nothing else, Arrow is positive proof of Pushkin's conjecture that villainy and genius are two things that never go together. It's so remarkable to read something like that, especially in this day and age of the internet and vitriol and anger. It's so amazing to read something like that about an individual. And I'm wondering if your character you attribute to your parents, your home.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I can comment on this in any way that's suitable, but I think I certainly was brought up the idea that you don't boast. I mean, I was brought up as though it's not as though it was drilled into me. It was just taken for granted. You don't boast. That that you got to be concerned about other. You don't want to show other people up. This was just taken for granted.
So you don't understand Twitter?
Well, I don't even know what it is. I mean, I've never Twittered, so I read what it is, but I have no idea what it's all about.
Thank you, Professor Arrow.
Thank you.
We'll now take your questions. We'll be taking questions on 2 mics, I believe. It's on now.
Is it on now? Okay. Okay, I appreciate your life. But a few years ago, 20% of the value of the stock markets in the United States was invested in financial institutions. And I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but most of these institutions knew that they were backed up by the federal government through FDIC and other procedures. And they also knew that if they were to fail, it would be very probable the government would have to back them up. And now we're told that they have taken great amounts of money and somehow run it through a mathematical machine of tranches, and would put maybe 3,000 mortgages into different tranches with different risks and sell them around the world and around the country. And I'm pretty sure they'd have to do this by computer because nobody can keep track of 3,000 things. Okay, they knew that it would be heads they win and the public tails the public loses. So my question to you is, do you think it would be at all possible to unwind all these supposedly incomprehensible financial instruments that they created in order to hide their trail?
Well, first, let's make some things clear. The FDIC guarantees commercial banks. The fact is that commercial banks are not the issue. There's no particular problem with commercial banks. One or two have failed. That's been taken care of. It's not the commercial banks that have created the problem that are the problem here. They're going along pretty well. So the FDIC has performed its functions, and it has not been called on to put up its money. The big problem has been the investment banks and some of the hedge funds. Now, some of them have gone out of business. Bear Stearns went out of business. Lehman Brothers went out of business. It's much bigger firms. There weren't that. There are only a few large ones. That's two very large ones. They have now the question. Now you're raising a very interesting question. Should we bail out the ones that remain? Should we, the AIG, for example, through its credit default swaps? Now, the argument is that there was no guarantee. They did not know. There was no formal guarantee. The FDIC is a formal guarantee, but that has not been the big issue. There was no formal guarantee. They had no way of knowing whether they would be protected. Now, you might say they assumed that they'd be protected. I think one has to say that. And there's something to that. When a very large bank is in trouble, they're rescued somehow. This has happened over the years. Every now and then there's been some very large bank. There was Continental, Illinois. When was it? In the 1970s, was it? Or 80s. And then the S&L crisis. They probably have some view that they will be bailed out. But of course, the stockholders in Bear Stearns are wiped out. The stockholders in Citicorp have, so far at least, the market is correct, but almost wiped out. So it's not quite as though there's no cost to somebody. There are real costs being borne by somebody. Now you can some of the people in the corporations have been laid off and so on. Now so I want to say that it's not clear to me that there isn't a lot of pain. There's a disappearance of a huge amount of wealth. I would see, if I recall correctly, Citicorp wrote down almost $100 billion. So somebody is suffering in this thing. Now, the individual executives are being treated possibly much better than they should be. I think there's a good argument for that. And I don't want to defend the view that they should protect. The question is, the people we're concerned about it, however, is the people to whom Citicorp would lend money, or the people to whom, or to the insurers, the people who take insurance. The trouble is there's no easy way of letting these corporations go down without causing pain to a lot of people who are not involved in the story, and a lot more pain to them than to the others. So it's a dilemma. And I think this is that's one of the reasons why I said before our regulations should make sure that the leverage ratios are much higher, so that the cost falls on the company a lot before it falls on other people. The present situation permit the costs to get spread to innocent bystanders too quickly, and that is the fault of the financial deregulation which has occurred in the last two administrations.
Take a question here on the left.
In your earlier discussion, you touched on healthcare financing, and President Obama has said that in order to solve the economic problems that we have today, he has to deal with the banking, the toxic mortgages, the healthcare financing, energy, and education. My question is, do you agree with President Obama that he should take on healthcare financing at this time, or do you think he has too much on his plate, and from an economic point of view, might he be better off postponing that for a couple of years?
That's a political judgment, which I'm probably not terribly competent to make. I think the health care has to be handled. It's not, in some sense, it's not a problem of the same imminence as the others. It's a long-term problem. It is exacerbated now, as I pointed out before, by the fact that people are losing their health coverage because of job losses. So there tends to be an immediate crisis. The immediate crisis in health is exacerbated. It's made more. But it's true, the fundamental problem of health care is a problem of the long run, but not such a very long run. We're really running into financial trouble in a fairly quick way. Now, whether the country is better off with a lot of saying, well, this is the time to reform, let's reform, and get everything done, or whether it's best to string it out is, I think, not clear to me. A lot of this, the New Deal legislation did take place over several years. In the sense of looking back in time, we tend to forget about these differences. But it was the banking reform was very quick. And by the way, financial regulation, I think, should be a fairly imminent matter. Even though financial regulation doesn't do much to help the present crisis. It's a friendly future one, but it's immediately on our mind. It probably is worth doing, and doing quickly, because this is the time. I think the health care, it's probably, look, I'm sure this process will take several years. If you start it right now, this is a process that's going to take years anyway. So you might just as well start it now.
Over here on the right.
Hello, it's an honor to ask you a question. I've been curious about demographics, and especially in the United States and in Japan and Italy. In the United States, in particular, with the baby boomers. And as the baby boomers age, what sort of effects do you anticipate on aggregate demand and tax policy and asset values and home values and things like that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite capture you, sir.
Yes, so I was asking, this is better? I was asking about the effect of aging populations, especially in the United States, the baby boomers, and the effect going forward on economic growth, asset prices, home prices, the ability to tax, the ability to borrow, the ability to save.
Well, first place, there are transitional problems created by changes in aging. In fact, we are less affected by this than a lot of other parts of the world. We still have our reproduction rate is still we're still above reproduction rates, and in addition we have immigration. So the United States is not your prime. Japan is the extreme case, and Italy, Spain, Germany are showing the signs of aging populations. Now, it strikes me as very interesting. Japan is really facing this problem well ahead of anything we are. The Japanese don't seem to think it's a catastrophe. They seem to be they're figuring out adjusting to it. And putting it another way, we have to contemplate that the population of the world stabilizes at some point. And many people feel we're fairly close to that point now. The official forecasts are that the population of the world will grow by another 2 billion and stop there. Forecasts like this have been wrong before, but whatever it is, those are the best forecasts for the current. So we're looking forward to a world, and we have to look forward to a world of stationary population. It's almost an arithmetical necessity. Well, whenever you get to that world, you're going to have to face the fact that you have a stationary population, which means an age distribution skewed, less skewed toward the young, was a better way of putting it. Let's say skewed. And of course, on top of that, we have increased longevity due to medical advances. I think one answer has got to be, of course, that people will have to work longer. It seems to be the retirement age has got to shift. And there's a phrase, today's 80 is yesterday's 65 or something like that. Well, there's something to that kind of way of putting it. Because people have longer lifetimes, they are healthier. It's also true that they're healthier and more capable of working. So it seems to me inevitable that we meet this problem by changing the definition of retirement so that the ratio between retired and workers is going to be constant. So I don't see that. It seems to me that it's something, of all the economic problems, I regard this as one of the less serious.
Over here on the left.
Yes, thank you. On the matter of the toxic assets these banks are holding and how to get rid of them, Mr. Geithner has come up with a novel public-private scheme of some sort, and I notice that Mr. Krugman is cool, and Stieglitz has come out with what appears to be an empirical reason why it won't work with equity, I should say, to taxpayers. What do you think of this public-private scheme that's coming along in regard to the equity for taxpayers?
Well, I don't. The real trouble is it's not terribly good, but I'm not sure what they will. I have not seen either Professor Krugman or Professor Stiglitz really give an alternative. I don't know what else you would do. I think the percentage
would be the alternative.
Well, I don't think it's mean. I don't think that nationalization actually doesn't change the problem. It seems to me that doesn't actually meet the toxic assets are there. Whether it's called nationalize, if you nationalize it, then the government's taking all the risk. So it's not clear to me that a public-private partnership isn't superior to government ownership. First, it's a way of establishing a value. The government owns it, you don't know what the value is, and then it's subject to political manipulation. Now, I think the actual terms are too generous to the private sector. The percentage that the private sector should put up is too low. I mean, that's one point where Professor Stiglitz, I think, I agree with. It's too low, and I think there should be a higher percentage demanded. But the principle, I think, is a pretty sound one, because I can't see any other. Nothing is going to be very good, but I can't see any method, because nationalizing, I think, really conceals the issue. It doesn't go away at all. I'm not sure it conceals it even. I'm not sure I don't think it's a genuine solution.
We have time for two more questions. One over here.
I would like to ask you a question about healthcare and education. You seem to be prescribed the same prescription for handling both of them. And so my question is, if government, you suggest that government should pretty much make available for everybody higher education. Who will control quality and cost? And the same question about healthcare. So who will control quality and cost, and who kind of will push innovation? I mean, we in Silicon Valley know only one way for innovation. It's greed. If you have Silicon Valley billionaires who make a lot of money, and this is how we get all innovation. So if you remove profit, greed from healthcare and higher education, would you pretty much become stagnant? So we will have healthcare, but we will have in 20 years, 50 years from now, we will have the same healthcare, like we have the same education, and we will argue, okay, how we will pay teacher, how we decide who's a good teacher, bad teacher, and we will argue about this, about doctors from now until whatever.
Well, in the case of higher education, I think your case isn't very good, because higher education has never been run on a profit-making basis. There's a trivial number of universities. There is a small number of universities today, mostly online universities, which operate on a profit basis, but they are not the ones anybody admires. The fact is that universities, even though we have in the United States, of course it's true in the United States, the bulk of higher education is public. Most students go to higher education going to public institutions right now. But the private institutions are not profit-making institutions either. They're not motivated by greed. Stanford University, whatever may be said, is good or bad, is run by people who give money voluntarily and some fees and whatnot. So it's not, the universities are not really being run now on a profit. They're not like Google or Yahoo or whatever. They are being run on a basis which is very different. In the traditional university, traditional university is a corporation of the faculty. You go back to the origins of the university in the Middle Ages. These were organizations of faculty offering courses. They weren't profit-making institutions. They charged fees. We've found that professional administrators have taken over a bigger and bigger role as time goes on, but they're certainly not here to maximize profit. They maximize prestige, they maximize reputation, or things like that, but they do not And so the fact is we've had very successful higher education. There's some parts of the world where the bulk of the universities are state universities. I mean, I shouldn't have said it. The bulk of the universities here are state universities, but the most prestigious universities are the state universities. So you go to Japan or France. They're virtually, there are private universities, but they are not it is the public universities that are regarded as the ones with the highest reputation and the highest, who look for the best students. The United States is a little different, though we have some absolutely excellent public universities too. And a great deal of scholars, some of the best scholars are to be found at University of California, the different branches of the University of California, or University of Wisconsin. Some branches of the State University of New York are outstanding. So I think it's really, the empirical evidence shows that the forces of greed, which I think really worked very well in innovations in Silicon Valley, are not the decisive factors in higher education.
Excuse me, we have to move on to a final question over here. Thank you.
Hi. I've read that winners of Nobel Prizes and Turing Awards and so on, once they win the award, in the subsequent years, their research is adversely affected because they end up spending a lot of time on committees and giving talks and so on. And you clearly seem to be an exception to that, but I was wondering if, what your thoughts were on this based on either your experiences or other people who you know.
How did you protect yourself from being a failure?
I haven't really thought about this systematically. I should, before I venture it, I should do an empirical study. It struck me most of those in economics, for the most part, have continued to do their work. Well, there were some that were given at a relatively late age when they're not, you didn't expect them to do much more work. But those that I can think of offhand, and I really would have to, I hesitate to answer this without looking through the list of advisors, and say which of them stopped working and which of them continued. I think most of those who got it at an age where they expect to continue working, continued working. Part of the problem is somebody said, well, look, it's like tenure. Do people stop working when they get tenure? Well, the argument is those who get tenure are so habituated to work, they don't know what else to do.
Thank you, Ken Arrow, and thank you for joining us. See you.
Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.